Have you ever felt like a secret part of you, a past life filled with passion and purpose, is just waiting to be seen? What if the person society sees as invisible holds the key to saving lives? This is the story of Eleanor Blackwood, a quiet janitor with a calm demeanor and a gentle spirit. For 11 years, she's walked the sterile halls of an Air Force base, pushing her cleaning cart, a ghost in a world of high-tech heroes. But beneath her unassuming uniform and a simple ponytail lies the heart of a pilot, a legend whose career was cut short by a single, impossible choice. Tonight, as a desperate radio call fills the air, Eleanor's two worlds are about to collide, forcing her to choose between the safety of her quiet anonymity and the lives of 8 pilots who desperately need the extraordinary woman she used to be. At exactly 2:47 a.m., on a cold night at Peterson Air Force Base, nestled in Colorado Springs, the calm of the early morning was shattered by the sudden crackle of the radio. 8 F-18 Super Hornets, returning from a highly classified mission over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, found themselves plunged into an unexpected nightmare. One by one, their aircraft were hit simultaneously by a barrage of critical failures. Engines sputtered and died, fuel began leaking dangerously, and electrical systems flickered and failed without warning. The voice of the lead pilot sliced sharply through the radio static, tense and urgent. "Mayday, Mayday, Peterson Tower, this is Crimson Squadron. Requesting immediate emergency landing. We have multiple aircraft in distress." For years, this would have been just another call in the endless stream of air traffic chatter. But that night, it was something far more dire, something that would unravel the very protocols governing military flight operations and expose a secret that had quietly lingered for over a decade, unnoticed. The person who would rise to meet this crisis wasn't the seasoned air traffic controller, nor a veteran pilot or commanding officer. Instead, it was Eleanor Blackwood, the night shift janitor, quietly pushing her mop and cart through the hallways, invisible to most, but harboring a past that few could even imagine. Eleanor had been quietly sweeping and cleaning the control tower of Peterson AFB for 11 years. Each night from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., her footsteps echoed softly down the sterile, dimly lit corridors. She moved with the steady rhythm of routine, passing the skeletal crew of air traffic controllers who handled the overnight flights. To most of the base's personnel, she was just another civilian contractor, the background noise in the base's ongoing operations, a face easily overlooked. At 52 years old, Eleanor possessed an unassuming presence that made people glance right past her. Her stature was average, with streaks of gray threading through her once dark brown hair, tied back into a simple ponytail. She wore the base-issued custodian uniform, navy blue slacks and a matching polo shirt. Quiet efficiency defined her every movement, never drawing attention, never causing disturbance. She was the quintessential model employee, punctual, reliable, diligent, and utterly unremarkable in the eyes of most. But Eleanor Blackwood was not just a janitor, far from it. Over 2 decades earlier, she was Captain Eleanor Mitchell, one of the youngest pilots ever to graduate from the Air Force Academy. By the time her military career was cut short, she had amassed over 3,000 flight hours across an impressive range of aircraft, or from nimble F-16 Fighting Falcons to the massive C-130 Hercules transports. She held qualifications that were the envy of many: aerial refueling, formation flying, and advanced emergency landing procedures, skills that only a handful of pilots had mastered. Her service record gleamed with commendations, earned through exceptional skill, razor-sharp instincts, and a calm demeanor under pressure. Then came the incident that changed everything. It was 2001, during a routine training exercise high above the Nevada desert. Eleanor was leading a formation of 4 F-16 fighters when disaster struck. Lieutenant Sarah Chone, Eleanor's wingman, suddenly suffered a catastrophic hydraulic failure at 30,000 feet. Without hydraulic control, Chun lost command over the aircraft's primary flight services. The only standard option was immediate ejection. But Chun's fighter was hurtling toward a populated area near Las Vegas. If she ejected, the plane would become an uncontrolled missile, crashing into a neighborhood below. Eleanor's response defied every rule, every protocol drilled into pilots since day one. Without hesitation, she positioned her own F-16 beneath Chun's crippled jet and physically nudged it, pushing and guiding Chun's aircraft away from the populated zones. Flight manuals insisted such a maneuver was impossible. Yet Eleanor performed it flawlessly, steering the doomed fighter clear of the city and allowing Chun to eject safely over an empty stretch of desert. The move saved countless lives on the ground, but it cost Eleanor her career. Rather than praise, the investigation fixated on the breach of protocol. 2 aircraft, 2 pilots, and one bold move that had risked everything. Military rules were absolute, and breaking them meant the end of the line. Though the review board recognized her skill and noble intent, they could not ignore the rules she had violated. Eleanor was honorably discharged, full benefits, but no more flights. Commercial airlines balked at her record, and flight schools rejected her as an instructor. The stigma of her rule-breaking lingered, effectively barring her from the skies she loved. Slowly, inexorably, she was pushed out of the world of aviation entirely. Grounded. The only jobs that remained were those far removed from the cockpit and the clouds. She took the janitor position at Peterson Air Force Base, not because she had to, but because it allowed her to stay close to the life she had lost. Even if she couldn't fly anymore, at least she could be near the planes, hear the radio chatter, and watch the runway lights flicker against the night sky. It was a fragile connection, but it was enough to keep her tethered to a world that still called to her heart. For over a decade, Eleanor kept her pilot's license alive through weekend flights. She couldn't afford anything fancy, usually renting small Cessnas at local airfields, but she kept her skills sharp. She studied every new manual, every technical update, staying current with advancements in aviation technology and evolving procedures. Her small apartment was a shrine to flight stacked with magazines, technical journals, and flight simulators where she practiced emergency scenarios she prayed never to face again. To the other custodial staff, Eleanor was a quiet woman who worked the night shift and stayed out of trouble. She preferred it that way. The night shift air traffic controllers barely registered her presence as she cleaned around their workstations, a ghostly figure in the background. She had become part of the base's furniture, unseen and unremarkable. But Eleanor heard everything. Night after night, she absorbed the radio communications between the tower and pilots. She listened to the routine flight updates, weather briefings, and coordination chatter. More importantly, she caught the faintest hints of trouble: equipment malfunctions, sudden course changes, medical emergencies, fuel shortages. Over the years, she built an encyclopedic knowledge of the base's operations, runway preferences in different wind conditions, radar blind spots, emergency protocols, and the locations of rescue equipment. In many ways, Eleanor understood the intricacies of Peterson Air Force Base better than some of the controllers themselves. On the night of March 15th, Eleanor followed her usual routine. She began by emptying wastebaskets in the administrative offices, then moved on to mop the floors along the main corridors. By 2:30 a.m., she had arrived in the control tower where Senior Airman Marcus Rodriguez was overseeing the overnight air traffic duties. Marcus was capable but inexperienced, having been stationed at Peterson for only 8 months. The overnight shift was usually quiet, with minimal air traffic and routine procedures. Plenty of time to ease into the responsibilities without pressure. Eleanor was cleaning the control tower windows overlooking the runway when the first emergency call shattered the calm. "Peterson Tower, this is Crimson Leader. We have an emergency situation, requesting immediate priority landing for 8 aircraft. Marcus's voice remained steady, but betrayed a hint of concern as he responded. "Crimson Leader, Peterson Tower, state the nature of your emergency." "Tower, we're experiencing multiple system failures across the squadron. Engine problems, fuel leaks, electrical malfunctions. We need to get these birds on the ground immediately." Eleanor froze, her cleaning cloth suspended midair. She had heard thousands of radio communications in her years here, but something in that lead pilot's voice was different. This wasn't a routine glitch or precautionary landing request. This was a true emergency involving multiple aircraft in jeopardy. Marcus was doing his job, responding by the book, but Eleanor sensed the tremor of uncertainty in his tone. Marcus Rodriguez sat tensely behind the radar console, his young hands moving swiftly but carefully, following every step of the protocol drilled into him. Night shift air traffic control was supposed to be routine, steady, uneventful. But this was anything but. 8 aircraft simultaneously signaling distress was a scenario no one had prepared him for. His voice was steady on the radio as he coordinated with emergency crews, urgently alerting fire and rescue teams and clearing all other airspace traffic to prioritize the unfolding crisis. Yet as the minutes stretched on, it became painfully clear the complexity of the situation far exceeded anyone's initial assessment. Outside, a ferocious storm was rapidly advancing from the west. Dark clouds swelling, gusting winds whipping fiercely, rain pounding down in torrents, and deadly wind shear developing with every passing second. The base's primary runway was already reporting crosswinds dangerously close to the maximum safe limits for landing, and the forecast promised no relief anytime soon. On top of the brutal weather, the squadron's troubles were compounding by the minute. Two of the F-18 Super Hornets reported critically low fuel levels, meaning diversion to alternate airfields wasn't even an option. Another fighter suffered a complete electrical failure, forcing its pilot to rely solely on backup instruments in the pre-dawn gloom. The voice of Crimson Leader, the squadron's lead pilot, remained professional and clipped over the comms. But Eleanor Blackwood, listening in the shadowed control tower, could detect the tension threading through every word. The options were rapidly dwindling. Rodriguez was executing every emergency protocol perfectly, coordinating with each agency with a calm efficiency belying his inexperience. But Eleanor's years in the cockpit granted her insight beyond the standard procedures. This wasn't a textbook emergency. This was something far more dangerous. The relentless combination of multiple aircraft failures, deteriorating weather, and the unforgiving pressure of time created a perfect storm that no manual could fully address. Her mind raced, calculating approach paths, estimating fuel burn rates, and plotting landing sequences with the kind of precision that only decades of aviation experience could produce. She tried to pull herself back, reminding herself this wasn't her responsibility anymore. Marcus was handling it, but it was impossible to switch off. Every instinct screamed at her that this crisis was spiraling beyond what conventional air traffic control protocols could contain. The first major sign of trouble emerged when Marcus struggled to maintain clear communication with three of the F-18s. Minor electrical glitches had snowballed into full communication blackouts. The lead pilot had to relay messages between the tower and his wingmen, injecting dangerous delays into a situation where every second counted. Then the weather took a cruel turn for the worse. Eleanor set down her cleaning supplies and edged closer to the radio console, eyes fixed on the radar screen. The 8 aircraft approached from the southwest. Their formations stretched irregularly as each plane battled separate mechanical problems. The ominous storm was visibly closing in on the base, its violent turbulence radiating out on the radar like an invisible predator. Rodriguez recommended a holding pattern in line with standard emergency procedure, but the pilots, strapped for fuel, couldn't afford the luxury of circling the skies. They had to land, now. Yet the weather was fast reaching a level that would test even the most seasoned aviator's skill and resolve. Crosswinds howled, wind shear threatened to yank the jets off course, and visibility was all but gone, converging to create an aviation nightmare. Eleanor watched Marcus desperately seeking updated weather reports from meteorology, flipping through emergency manuals, double-checking every protocol for handling multiple simultaneous emergencies. He was following the book, doing everything by the letter, but the book had no answers for this volatile storm of failures and risks. His professionalism was admirable, but Eleanor could see the strain mounting. He was edging toward the limits of his training and experience. The rapidly evolving crisis demanded snap judgments that only years of hands-on flying could provide. Standing in the dimly lit control tower, Eleanor faced a crossroads. She could remain the invisible janitor, quiet, unseen, responsible only for sweeping floors and emptying trash, watching helplessly as the disaster unfolded. Or she could step into the light, breaking the silence she'd kept for over a decade, revealing the secret buried beneath years of concealment. 8 F-18 Super Hornets hurtled through deadly weather, crippled by mechanical failures and running dangerously low on fuel. Their fate hinged on split-second decisions and razor-sharp judgment. But who could make those decisions when the usual protocols crumbled under pressure? The radio crackled again, the lead pilot's voice tense with urgency. "Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader, We're starting final approach. Conditions are critical, and our options are running out. In that instant, Eleanor Blackwood knew her years of hiding were coming to an end. The radar displayed 8 blips descending from 15,000 feet, each representing a priceless fighter jet and the lives of highly trained pilots. Marcus's hands danced across the controls, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill in the tower. His voice broke through static, requesting a fuel status report. After a tense pause, Crimson 2 responded, voice strained. Tower Crimson 2, we have approximately 12 minutes of fuel at current consumption. We need to be on the ground within 8 minutes or we're in serious trouble. Eleanor's chest tightened. With only a 12-minute fuel reserve and an 8-minute window to land, there was virtually no margin for error. Abortions of the landing approach due to weather would mean no fuel for a second try. The pilot would be forced to eject, losing both plane and pilot. Marcus juggled multiple radio channels, communicating with the squadron, ground emergency teams, meteorologists, and base operations. But Eleanor could see his responses slowing, his speech becoming tentative. The weight of the crisis was pressing down on him. Then came the ominous update. Severe downdrafts at 12,000 feet were forcing the aircraft apart. The once tight formation was unraveling under violent turbulence, making coordinated landings exponentially more complex. Crimson Leader Peterson Tower, formation breaking up due to turbulence. We may not hold formation for approach. Eleanor's worst fears were confirmed. The F-18s depended on formation discipline to maintain safety and timing, but with the storm tearing them apart, each jet would need individualized guidance, an impossible workload for one young controller in a ticking time bomb of a situation. Marcus keyed his mic asking Crimson Leader if they were ready to begin individual approaches. The response was an urgent negative. They had to land as a group. Individual sequences would take too long given their fuel state. Eleanor leaned in, studying the radar display with an expert eye. Then she spotted it, something Marcus hadn't noticed. The current approach vector was steering the squadron directly into the heart of the storm's worst turbulence. The pilots were clinging to formation through conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. Suddenly, one radar blip veered away from the group. Crimson 6 was falling behind, likely engine troubles worsening under the relentless strain. The air was thick with turbulence, tossing the fighter jets like leaves caught in a storm. Crimson 6 was struggling desperately, pushing the battered aircraft to its absolute limits, straining to stay in formation. Through the radio crackled the pilot's tense voice. Tower Crimson 6 here. I'm losing power on my number 2 engine. I'm going to have to fall back from the formation. Marcus Rodriguez, the young night shift air traffic controller, reacted swiftly, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. Crimson 6 Peterson Tower, roger that. You're experiencing engine failure. Do you require priority handling? No, Tower. I can keep the aircraft under control, but I won't be able to keep pace with the squadron's approach speed. Now Rodriguez found himself caught between impossible choices. Prioritizing Crimson 6 would mean breaking up the carefully coordinated formation, risking the fuel reserves of the remaining pilots. Without enough fuel for individual approaches, they might be forced into dangerous solo landings. On the other hand, maintaining the group approach meant that Crimson 6 would inevitably fall behind, forced to face the worsening storm alone. Eleanor Blackwood, silently watching the unfolding crisis, instinctively began running mental calculations. Approach speeds, fuel consumption, timing sequences, all spinning like a complex three-dimensional puzzle in her mind. Years of experience as a former Air Force pilot flooded back, allowing her to see solutions invisible to Rodriguez, trapped behind his limited perspective and growing pressure. Yet she fought every instinct urging her to speak up. Outside, the weather radar painted a grim picture. The storm was intensifying. Winds were shifting, growing stronger, and the rain hammered down harder, closing the narrow window for safe landings. In just 15 minutes, the conditions would degrade so severely that even emergency landings could turn fatal. Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader here. We're initiating final approach. Winds are variable and visibility is dropping fast. We need guidance on the best vector for our approach. Rodriguez checked his weather data and began issuing the standard instructions. But Eleanor saw the truth. His information was already outdated. The storm was evolving too fast for the meteorological instruments to keep up. Unbeknownst to Rodriguez, the current approach path would lead the squadron directly into a newly formed wind shear zone, a deadly hazard that had sprung up only moments ago. Her heart hammered as she watched the 8 jets descend, their pilot battling to hold formation amid the violent air currents. The radar showed them fighting desperately to keep proper spacing, but one aircraft was already straying off the glide path, and 2 others struggled to maintain approach speed. Then the call came through, the moment Eleanor dreaded. Mayday, Mayday! Crimson 4 is in an uncontrolled descent. We've lost hydraulics and primary flight controls. Despite the panic in his chest, Rodriguez's voice remained calm and measured. Crimson 4, Peterson Tower. Roger, your Mayday. Emergency services are standing by. Can you maintain controlled flight? Negative, Tower. The aircraft isn't responding. I'm going to have to eject. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Ejecting in these conditions was almost a death sentence. The violent turbulence, the thick darkness, the fierce winds, it all meant the pilot would be at the mercy of a storm that could carry him miles off course. Rescue teams would have no easy task locating him in the chaos. But an even more immediate danger loomed. A pilotless fighter jet, hurtling out of control, would continue its descent toward the ground, a deadly projectile. Its path could intersect with the other 7 F-18s still on approach, turning a dire emergency into a catastrophic collision. Rodriguez juggled these crises with growing strain. He was the only controller managing the emergency response for Crimson 4's ejection, while simultaneously guiding 7 other aircraft through increasingly hostile weather. Crimson Leader, be advised. Crimson 4 may eject on your approach path. You may need to initiate missed approach procedures. Tower, Crimson Leader, we don't have the fuel for missed approaches. We must get these aircraft on the ground now. The tension in the room was palpable. 7 jets committed to landing with dangerously low fuel, 1 uncontrolled fighter spiraling toward disaster, and a storm closing in fast. Standard protocols offered little guidance for such a complex nightmare. Eleanor knew something had to be done. She stepped forward quietly from the shadows, approaching Rodriguez's console. His eyes were glued to the radar, his fingers busy on the radio. He barely noticed her at first. "Excuse me," Eleanor said softly. Rodriguez startled, turning to face the unexpected presence. "Ma'am, you need to stay back. We're handling a critical situation here." "I know," Eleanor replied, "and I believe I can help." He frowned, irritation flashing across his face. The last thing he needed was interference from a janitor during an emergency. "Please step away. I don't have time for distractions." But Eleanor's voice was calm and authoritative. Crimson 4's aircraft is projected to crash about 2 miles northeast of the runway threshold. She paused, eyes locked on the radar. Based on the trajectory and descent rate, the wreckage won't interfere with the other aircraft's approach path. You can continue with the group landing sequence. Rodriguez stared at her, disbelief washing over him. How could a janitor know so much about flight paths and trajectory calculations? Before he could respond, Eleanor pressed on. "The real danger is the wind shear layer at 800 feet. Your current approach vector leads the squadron straight through it. You need to adjust their glide path to approach from the southeast instead of the southwest. It'll add 90 seconds to their approach, but 3 aircraft don't have enough fuel margins for wind shear recovery." Rodriguez's mouth fell open. The precision and correctness of her analysis were undeniable. Who was this woman? "I'm someone who can help you save 7 pilots," she said simply. "There's no time for explanations now. Crimson Leader is 30 seconds from entering that wind shear zone. Once committed to the current approach, it'll be too late to change course." The radio crackled urgently again. "Peterson Tower, Crimson Leader, severe downdrafts encountered. Aircraft struggling to maintain glide path." Rodriguez looked from Eleanor to the radar and back again. His training told him to maintain control and not accept assistance from unauthorized personnel. But the evidence was right before him. Her expertise could be the difference between life and death. "What do you recommend?" he asked, swallowing his pride. Eleanor moved closer to the console. "Vector them to a right turn, heading 140. Descend to 2,000 feet and establish a wide approach pattern from the southeast. The wind conditions are far more stable there, and it will give the trailing aircraft extra time to manage their mechanical issues. Rodriguez hesitated, then keyed his microphone. Crimson Leader, Peterson Tower. Execute immediate right turn to heading 140. Descend and maintain 2,000 feet. Vectoring for southeast approach to runway 35. Tower Crimson Leader. Confirm right turn 140. Descend to 2,000 feet. This will add time to our approach. We're critical on fuel. Trust me, Rodriguez relayed. The new approach will be more stable and safer for landing. Eleanor watched the radar as the remaining 7 F-18s began their turn. The maneuver stretched their formation slightly, increasing separation and reducing collision risk during final approach. Crimson 4, Peterson Tower. Status? Several tense seconds passed before a voice cut through the static. Tower, this is Crimson Leader. Crimson 4 successfully ejected at 3,000 feet. We observed a clean chute deployment. The pilot is likely down near Highway 94, roughly 3 miles northeast of the base. Rodriguez immediately began coordinating ground rescue teams, springing into action to search for the downed pilot, relief flooding through the room as hope flickered back into the night. Eleanor Blackwood, once known as Captain Eleanor Mitchell, was quietly observing the situation unfold before her. Despite her current job as a janitor, her sharp mind remained locked on the radar screen. The pilot who had gone down was out of the picture now, but Eleanor's attention stayed razor-focused on the 7 remaining aircraft still circling and preparing to land. She noted the southeast approach was holding steady thanks to the more stable wind conditions coming from that direction. But she also knew they couldn't afford to relax. The landings would need to be choreographed carefully, every move precisely timed. Her gaze flicked across the data, registering that Crimson 2 and Crimson 6 were both signaling fuel emergencies. Crimson 7's updates revealed intermittent electrical failures. Marcus Rodriguez, the young air traffic controller sitting beside her, stared in growing disbelief. How could she possibly know all these intricate details? He had been listening to their transmissions for the last 40 minutes, but Eleanor was clearly seeing far more than he could. Calmly, she explained, Crimson 2 reported they only had 12 minutes of fuel left, and that was 38 minutes ago. Crimson 6 is losing power in his number 2 engine, which means he's burning fuel faster than usual. And Crimson 7, he suffered 3 separate electrical glitches, most likely due to water damage in his avionics bay. Rodriguez realized then that Eleanor was tracking this unfolding crisis with the precision and insight of a veteran air traffic controller, her mind piecing together every radio call and status update in a way his inexperienced brain couldn't yet manage. The complexity of juggling multiple channels and coordinating the flights had overwhelmed him, but Eleanor's analysis went deeper, sharper, clearer. Crimson 2, Peterson Tower. You're cleared for a straight-in approach to runway 35. Emergency crews are standing by, Eleanor instructed through the radio. Tower Crimson 2, Roger, cleared for approach. We're showing less than 4 minutes of fuel remaining, came the pilot's urgent reply. Eleanor moved closer to Rodriguez, her voice dropping with serious urgency. He's not going to make it if he follows a standard approach. You need to have him set up for the straight-in power-off approach. Engines cut at 2 miles out. He'll have to glide to the runway. It's the only shot he's got. Rodriguez blinked, confused. He'd never even heard of such a procedure. Yet something about the confidence and knowledge in Eleanor's voice convinced him this was exactly what needed to be done. Crimson 2 Tower, he repeated hesitantly. When you reach 2 miles from the runway threshold, shut down both engines and configure for a power-off approach. You'll be gliding the rest of the way. Did you say power-off approach? Came the incredulous voice of Crimson 2. I've never practiced that in an F-18. Before Rodriguez could respond, Eleanor took the microphone. The young controller was too stunned to argue. This is Peterson Tower. The power-off approach is your best chance to conserve fuel. Maintain 180 knots until 1 mile final, then drop your landing gear and flaps. It'll be a steep descent, but the runway's long enough for a safe rollout. Trust your training and fly the aircraft all the way to the ground. There was a brief silence, then a voice cracked through. Tower, who is this? You're not Rodriguez. This is someone who knows how to fly, Eleanor replied smoothly. Execute the power-off approach as instructed. You can do this. The radio was silent for several long seconds before Crimson 2 finally responded. Roger, power off approach, shutting down engines at 2 miles final. Rodriguez stared at Eleanor in stunned disbelief. She had just taken over his frequency and given direct flight instructions to a military pilot using a procedure he'd never even seen in any manual. Who are you? He asked, breathless. Before Eleanor could answer, another emergency erupted. Crimson 7's electrical problems escalated into a full avionics failure. The pilot was now flying entirely on backup instruments, battling stormy weather without radio contact, radar transponder, or any electronic landing aids. On the radar, Eleanor spotted a blip moving erratically toward the runway. That's Crimson 7, she said quietly. He's lost all electronics and is flying manually. He can't hear your transmissions and has no idea about the landing sequence. The situation was spiraling out of control. 6 F-18s were lined up at various stages of approach, each with different fuel levels and mechanical issues, while a 7th craft approached blindly and silently. The risk of a mid-air collision or runway incursion was climbing with every passing second. Eleanor's experienced mind knew the standard air traffic control procedures wouldn't be enough anymore. This demanded tactical, three-dimensional thinking, the kind born from years of flying high-stress missions and making split-second decisions. She turned to Rodriguez with a firm, determined look and said, I need you to trust me. I can get these planes on the ground safely, but I'm going to have to bend some rules. Things you won't find in any procedures manual. Rodriguez glanced at the radar screen, showing the 7 aircraft converging dangerously, then back at Eleanor. The complexity was way beyond his training, but this woman clearly understood exactly what had to happen. What do you need? He asked. I need you to let me take control of this frequency and coordinate these landings. When it's all over, I'll explain everything, she replied calmly. Without hesitation, Rodriguez handed over the microphone and stepped back from the console. For the first time in 11 years, Eleanor Blackwood was back in control of aircraft operations. Her hands moved over the controls with the effortless muscle memory of someone who had spent countless hours in aviation command, adjusting frequencies, tuning radar settings, switching communications. All felt instinctive and natural. Rodriguez watched, amazed. This wasn't some random janitor fumbling with equipment. This was a professional, a pilot and controller returning to her element. Crimson Leader, this is Peterson Tower. New controller speaking. I need immediate status reports from all aircraft. Fuel levels, mechanical problems, everything, she ordered. The lead pilot's voice came back tinged with frustration. Tower, we don't have time for status reports. We need to get these jets on the ground now. Crimson Leader, I get your urgency, but I need the info to sequence your landing safely. 30 seconds of updates now could save you 5 minutes on approach, Eleanor replied with authority and calm assurance. There was a pause, then the pilot complied. Tower, Crimson Leader, 8 minutes of fuel left, all systems operational. Crimson 3 has 6 minutes, minor hydraulic leak. Crimson 5 has 10 minutes, intermittent electrical issues. Crimson 6 has 5 minutes, one engine producing reduced power. Crimson 7, no communication, status unknown. Crimson 8 has 12 minutes, systems operational. Eleanor absorbed the data instantly while studying the radar. 6 jets with fuel and mechanical challenges, plus 1 rogue aircraft without radio contact. The sequencing needed to be flawless, no margin for error. Crimson 6, Peterson Tower, you're first in sequence due to critical fuel. Descend to 1,500 feet. Reduce speed to 160 knots. Configure for straight-in approach to runway 35, Eleanor instructed. Tower Crimson 6 descending to 1,500 and reducing speed. Be advised, my number 2 engine is at about 60% power. I may need help with go-around procedures if the approach gets unstable. Crimson 6, no go-arounds planned. You're committed to this approach. Maintain heading and altitude until 3 miles from the threshold, then start final descent. Emergency crews are standing by. Rodriguez watched fascinated as Eleanor handled the complex sequencing with crisp professional radio calls. More importantly, she was thinking several steps ahead of every aircraft's position, already planning the approach for Crimson 3 while guiding Crimson 6 down. Crimson 3, Tower, you're second in sequence. Maintain 2,000 feet, heading 120 degrees. You'll start your approach once Crimson 6 has landed. Confirm your fuel status. Tower Crimson 3, fuel shows 4 minutes remaining. Might be optimistic given current power settings. Eleanor ran rapid mental calculations. Approach speeds, runway occupancy, fuel burn. Crimson 3 was dangerously close to running out. But if Crimson 6 could land smoothly and clear the runway fast enough, Crimson 3 had a chance. Crimson 3 reduced power to minimum sustainable. You'll execute a modified power-off approach starting at 1 mile final. This will conserve fuel and give you a good glide to the runway. Tower, I'm not familiar with power-off approaches in an F-18, came the reply. I am, Eleanor said confidently. Follow my instructions exactly. The aircraft will handle the approach. You just need to fly it properly. Meanwhile, the radar showed Crimson 7 continuing his wild, unpredictable flight path, completely disconnected from radio communications and unaware of the carefully coordinated landing plan unfolding below. He was heading toward the airfield on his own, completely unaware that his approach could disrupt the carefully choreographed dance of other incoming aircraft. Eleanor Blackwood leaned over the radar console, her sharp eyes tracing the errant blip on the screen. Years of experience whispered the answer before her mind consciously formed it, a solution that would have seemed reckless or even impossible to anyone unfamiliar with the deeper layers of aviation procedures. Rodriguez, she said, her voice calm but firm, activate the emergency lights on runway 17. The young air traffic controller hesitated, glancing up from his console, his brow furrowed in confusion. But all aircraft are scheduled to land on runway 35. Exactly, Eleanor replied, a hint of satisfaction in her tone. Crimson 7 can't hear us, but he can see. If we light up runway 17, he'll know to divert to the crosswind runway instead of crossing into the main approach pattern. That way, he won't endanger the others. Rodriguez blinked, his doubt showing in the nervous flick of his eyes. Will he even understand that signal? Any competent pilot will, she said without hesitation. Emergency lighting on a runway is a universal directive. Land there. It's Aviation 101 when radios go dark. Rodriguez swallowed, nodded, and his fingers danced across the console. A moment later, the lights of runway 17 blazed to life against the night. On the radar, the small green icon labeled Crimson 7 began to shift, turning to align with the newly illuminated runway. Eleanor allowed herself the faintest breath of relief. The maneuver had worked. He now had a clear path to land, separated from the others. Crimson 6, Tower, she said into the radio, smoothly transitioning to the next aircraft. You're 2 miles from touchdown. Configure gear and flaps as needed. Emergency crews are standing by, but your approach is stable. Tower Crimson 6, the pilot's voice came back, strained but composed. Gear down, flaps set. I see the runway lights. Approach feels good, even with the engine issue. Eleanor's attention split effortlessly. One part of her mind followed the F-18 on radar, tracing its slow crawl towards safety. Another coordinated with ground teams. Fire trucks positioned at the threshold, medics in standby, recovery crews ready to move at a moment's notice. Every heartbeat carried the weight of responsibility, yet she moved with a quiet steadiness that only years in the Air Force could teach. Crimson 6, you're looking good, she said. Maintain your current profile. Cleared to land, runway 35. The tower fell silent for nearly a minute, a vacuum of sound that seemed to stretch forever. Then, Tower Crimson 6, aircraft on the ground and rolling out, no assistance required, exiting taxiway Charlie. Rodriguez exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His relief was almost palpable, but Eleanor didn't pause. Her focus had already shifted. Crimson 3, Tower, cleared for approach. Descend to 1,200 feet. Maintain 150 knots until 1 mile final, then reduce to idle and configure for power-off landing. A beat of hesitation came through the radio. Tower Crimson 3, beginning descent to 1,200. Confirm power-off procedure? That's correct, Crimson 3. At 1 mile final, throttles idle. Gear down, full flaps. Maintain glide at 130 knots. Steeper descent than usual, but the runway is long enough. Do not add power to arrest the descent. Fly her to the ground and brake aerodynamically. Roger Tower, power off at 1 mile final. While Crimson 3 adjusted for his unusual approach, Eleanor's mind was already orchestrating the larger symphony. Crimson 5 was next, a priority, even with more fuel than some of the others. His electrical issues could spiral into something far worse at any moment. Crimson 5 Tower, report current electrical status. A moment's crackle, then a tense reply. Tower Crimson 5. Primary flight management and nav displays are gone. I'm on backups and hand flying. Controlled flight stable, but no electronic landing aids. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. Understood, Crimson 5. We'll run a manual approach. Reduce altitude to 1-800, heading 11110. When I give you the final turn, you'll be on runway centerline. This would be raw, old-school flying, relying on basic instruments and her voice alone. Few modern pilots had ever faced such a situation. But Eleanor had done it dozens of times. Back when she was Captain Mitchell's in the cockpit of an F-16, her life balanced on precision and instinct. Meanwhile, Crimson 3 was lining up for his power-off approach. Crimson 3 Tower, she said. On final. Throttles to idle. Configure to land. Tower Crimson 3. Throttles idle, gear down, flaps full. I see the runway. Feels really different from a normal approach. That's expected, Eleanor reassured him. Let the jet fly. Guide it. Don't fight it. The radar showed his descent profile steep but controlled. The F-18's aerodynamics carried it like a glider. Tower Crimson 3, aircraft on the ground, smooth landing, smoother than I thought. Eleanor nodded to herself. 2 down, 4 to go. Her gaze snapped to Crimson 7, silent and alone on the crosswind runway. His radar track told her he was aligned and stable, but she had no way to guide him or coordinate with emergency crews once he touched down. Rodriguez, she instructed, alert emergency teams. Crimson 7 landing on 17, no radio contact. Position support, but keep the runway clear until he stops. Then it was back to Crimson 5, who had just begun his most dangerous segment, the manual approach on failing instruments. Crimson 5 Tower, turn left heading 035. Begin descent to 1200, you're 4 miles out. Tower Crimson 5, left to 035, descending 1200. My altimeter's fluctuating. Static system may be blocked. Rodriguez glanced at Eleanor, wide-eyed. A compromised altimeter meant the pilot was practically flying blind for altitude. Crimson 5, disregard altimeter, Eleanor said, her voice steady as a rock. I'll provide altitude from radar. Maintain current descent. Turn left 025. You're drifting right of centerline. Tower, this is difficult, the pilot admitted. Heading control without my displays is... You're fine, she cut in. Trust your basic instruments. Follow my guidance. Right turn to 030. Maintain descent. 2 miles to touchdown. On the radar, she saw Crimson 7 touch down successfully. No radio call, but the aircraft rolled out clean. A silent victory. Crimson 5 Tower. Right turn 035. Begin final descent. Gear and flaps as needed. You're 1 mile out, lined up centerline. Tower Crimson 5. Gear down, flaps set. I see the approach lights. This is going to be tight. The manual approach demanded absolute focus. Eleanor's instructions became the lifeline between sky and earth. Crimson 5 Tower, you're on glide. Maintain. Cleared to land. Runway 35. Tower Crimson 5, I have the runway. Landing now. Moments later, Tower Crimson Arm, aircraft on the ground. 3 jets safe. 3 still airborne. Eleanor's pulse never quickened, but her thoughts raced as she assessed the last of the squadron. Crimson Leader, Crimson 8, and the unconfirmed condition of the radio-dead Crimson 7, now resting on the crosswind runway. The storm was worsening, wind howled at 40 knots, visibility dropping with each passing minute. Crimson Leader Tower, status report, fuel and mechanical condition? Tower Crimson Leader. 6 minutes fuel remaining, all systems green, Ready for approach. Crimson 8 reports status. Tower, Crimson 8, 10 minutes fuel, all systems operational. Standing by. The final approaches would be the hardest yet. The weather was turning the night into a battlefield of wind and water, and Eleanor knew that precision, absolute razor-edged precision, would decide whether the last three pilots made it home. The wind was restless that night, shifting unpredictably, but mostly sweeping in from the southwest. A crosswind of 20 to 30 knots threatened to shove any incoming fighter off its path during final approach. It was the kind of night that tested every fiber of a pilot's skill. The difference between veterans and rookies became painfully clear in these conditions. Landing a high-performance fighter in such weather demanded precise, almost surgical control. Every input had to be deliberate, every correction immediate yet restrained, as constant as breathing. Tower Crimson leader beginning final approach. Winds are definitely gusty down here. Eleanor Blackwood, once Captain Eleanor Mitchell, watched the glowing radar screen as the lead F-18 clawed its way through turbulence. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that only comes from living through storms like this one. Crimson leader, maintain center line control with your rudder. Don't overcorrect for wind drift. Small inputs, constant adjustments. On the scope, she could see the subtle wiggles of the aircraft's ground track as the pilot fought the wind, tiny deviations followed by precise recoveries. Yet the approach profile was steady, stable enough for a safe landing. Crimson leader tower, you're tracking center line. Cleared to land runway 35. A pause, then the steady voice of the pilot. Tower Crimson leader, aircraft on the ground. That was a challenging approach, but we're down safely. One down. One aircraft remaining, Eleanor said into the mic, her tone all business. Crimson 8 tower, you're the last in sequence. Weather's worsening, but your fuel state is good for a normal approach. Descend to 1,500 feet, heading 140. Tower Crimson 8, descending to 1500, heading 140. There was a tense pause. I've been watching the others. It looks like the weather's getting worse. Crimson 8 confirmed, Eleanor replied. Wind conditions are at the upper safety limit. You're cleared for approach. Take your time. Fly a stable profile. As the last Hornet lined up, Eleanor felt the weight of the last hours settle over her. 7 F-18 Super Hornets already sat safely on the ground, each one coaxed down under conditions that would rattle even the most seasoned air traffic controllers. They had faced mechanical malfunctions, fuel emergencies, and a sky turning hostile by the minute. Standard procedures hadn't been enough. Survival had depended on creative problem-solving and unflinching skill. Tower Crimson, 8 final approach, requesting landing clearance. Crimson, 8, cleared to land runway 35, emergency equipment standing by. Moments later, the last Hornet's wheels kissed the runway and rolled out to the taxiway. The crisis was over. Marcus Rodriguez, young and wide-eyed, turned toward Eleanor. His voice carried a mix of awe and disbelief. That was incredible. I've never seen anything like that. Eleanor set down the microphone. For the first time in 11 years, she had been wholly in her element, immersed in the sky without ever leaving the ground. The surge of satisfaction was almost overwhelming, yet it was tempered by the cold certainty that her secret was gone. We need to talk, Rodriguez said quietly. Who are you really? Before she could answer, the sharp ring of the tower phone sliced through the quiet. Rodriguez hesitated, sensing that whatever came next would change everything. Peterson Tower, Senior Airman Rodriguez speaking. Rodriguez, this is Colonel Margaret Hawthorne, Base Commander. I've been monitoring your frequency for the last 40 minutes. I need an immediate explanation of what just occurred in my airspace. Rodriguez swallowed hard and glanced at Eleanor. Ma'am, we successfully landed 8 F-18s under emergency conditions. All aircraft are down safely. No injuries. I'm aware of the outcome, Airman. What I want to know is who was providing air traffic control during the final 30 minutes. That voice was not yours, and the procedures being used were not standard Air Force protocols. The moment of truth had come. Eleanor gave a silent nod. Ma'am, Rodriguez said carefully, I received assistance from a civilian during the emergency. The individual has extensive aviation experience and provided crucial guidance. Without that help, We could have lost aircraft and pilots. Civilian personnel? Hawthorne's voice sharpened. Are you telling me you allowed an unauthorized individual to assume control of air traffic operations at a United States Air Force installation? Yes, ma'am. Under the circumstances, it was the right call. The line went silent for several long, suffocating seconds. Both of you will report to my office immediately, Hawthorne said at last, her voice controlled, but heavy with authority. Do not speak to anyone else about this incident until further notice. Rodriguez hung up slowly, his eyes wide. We're in serious trouble. Eleanor picked up her janitor's cart, the absurdity of it almost comical against the memory of the last hour. Maybe you are. I'm just a janitor who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stop, Rodriguez said firmly. I don't know who you really are, but what you did tonight wasn't the work of a janitor. Those techniques, power-off approaches, manual navigation guidance, emergency lighting protocols, I've never even heard of some of that. Even a senior controller would struggle. Eleanor started toward the elevator, but he stepped into her path. Before we face the colonel, I need to know what I'm walking into. Who are you? She hesitated. The young airman had trusted her with the lives of 8 pilots. He deserved the truth. My name is Eleanor Blackwood now, she said softly. But 23 years ago, I was Captain Eleanor Mitchell, United States Air Force, Academy Class of '98. Over 3,000 flight hours in fighters and transports, certified in advanced flight operations most pilots never touch. Rodriguez blinked, stunned. You're a former pilot. Then why this? It's a long story, short version. I made a call during a training exercise that saved lives but violated regs. They gave me an honorable discharge, but my flying career was over. Civilian aviation didn't want me either. Disciplinary mark on the record. She looked down at the scuffed floor. So I stayed 11 years, listening to the radios, watching operations, keeping up my license, studying manuals, running simulator scenarios, staying connected to the only world I ever really belonged to. Rodriguez shook his head, still reeling. And tonight, when we needed a solution no manual could give, you were here. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime. 2 security personnel waited in full uniform. Ma'am, sir, Colonel Hawthorne is expecting you. The ride to the commander's office was silent. Eleanor's hands trembled, not from fear, but from the fading surge of adrenaline. For over a decade, she had succeeded in being invisible. 1 hour of crisis had shattered all of that. Colonel Hawthorne's office radiated authority, walls lined with citations, photographs of aircraft in flight, and the weight of years of command. Eleanor felt the irony settle over her like a heavy flight jacket. After 11 quiet years, the sky had pulled her back into its grasp, and now there would be consequences. The colonel was a woman in her late 40s, her silver-streaked hair pulled into a precise bun that did nothing to soften the commanding presence of someone long accustomed to making hard calls under pressure. Sit down, both of you, Colonel Hawthorne said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of authority honed by decades of service. Rodriguez obeyed immediately, perching on the edge of the chair like a nervous cadet. His hands were slick with sweat. Rodriguez, Hawthorne continued, I want a complete chronological account of tonight's events. Start from the very first emergency call. He nodded quickly, swallowing hard before launching into his report. He described the moment the squadron's first distress call came in, the rapid escalation of mechanical failures across multiple aircraft, and the worsening weather that turned a tense night into a potential disaster. His voice trembled slightly as he admitted how, with each passing minute, he realized the situation was spiraling far beyond his experience and training. Then he recounted the unexpected intervention, the sharp observations from Miss Blackwood, her effortless grasp of technical details, and the split-second decision to let her take over air traffic coordination. Colonel Hawthorne listened silently, her face impassive, pen moving occasionally across a yellow legal pad. When Rodriguez finally finished, she shifted her sharp gaze toward Eleanor. Miss Blackwood, Hawthorne said, is that your legal name? Yes, ma'am, Eleanor replied evenly. I changed it after leaving the Air Force. What was your military designation and service record? Eleanor straightened in her chair and delivered her history without flinching. She recited her academy graduation, flight training, aircraft certifications, and finally the incident that had ended her military career. Her tone was calm and factual, absent of self-pity or defensiveness. The Nevada incident with Lieutenant Chun, Hawthorne said after a pause, her brow lifting ever so slightly. I'm familiar with that case. It was studied extensively at the Air Force Academy, held up as an example of extraordinary flying skill paired with, let's call it, questionable judgment regarding regulations. Yes, ma'am, Eleanor said, unblinking. I'm aware of the way it's been characterized. And your own assessment? Eleanor hesitated, thinking carefully before answering. I made the only decision I could live with. Following standard protocol would have meant a pilotless fighter jet crashing into a residential area with unknown casualties. I chose to break the rules to prevent that outcome. And the consequences of that choice? I lost my military career, she said quietly, but I kept my integrity. I saved lives, but the price was my commission. I have no regrets about the decision itself, only that it cost me the chance to serve. Hawthorne leaned back in her chair, studying Eleanor with the kind of penetrating, analytical look reserved for situations that were both complex and consequential. Tonight puts me in an unusual position, the colonel said finally. On one hand, you performed unauthorized air traffic control operations at a classified military installation, a serious violation of federal law and Air Force security protocol. On the other hand, your actions appear to have prevented the catastrophic loss of aircraft and personnel. Rodriguez spoke up quickly, his voice earnest. Ma'am, with respect, Miss Blackwood's assistance was crucial. Without her, I'm not sure we'd be talking about a safe landing tonight. I understand your perspective, Airman, Hawthorne said, giving him a small nod. And for the record, your conduct tonight reflects well on your judgment under pressure. But the larger implications of this incident are significant. This will draw attention far beyond this base. She rose from her chair and walked to the wide window that overlooked the airfield. Outside, the emergency crews still swarmed around the silent, grounded F-18s, their flashing lights casting brief blue and red glimmers across the glass. The investigation will involve multiple agencies, Hawthorne said without turning. The FAA will demand to know how a civilian gained access to our tower during an emergency. The Air Force Inspector General will review every breach of protocol, and if Congress gets wind of this, there may be hearings. Finally, she faced Eleanor again. Your aviation expertise is undeniable, but your presence in that control tower tonight, in the middle of a classified military operation, cannot simply be ignored. Eleanor nodded. I understand, Colonel. I'm prepared to face whatever consequences come from my actions tonight. Hawthorne studied her a long moment, then said, almost to herself, what troubles me is the waste of exceptional talent that led us here. Your service record, up until Nevada, was exemplary. And tonight you displayed abilities that most active duty pilots and controllers could only aspire to. Yet for over a decade, you've been mopping floors on a base where your skills could save lives. Eleanor's brow furrowed slightly. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand where this is going. The colonel returned to her desk and opened a thick folder that had been waiting there. What if I told you, she said slowly, that tonight's events might represent an opportunity instead of a disaster? Eleanor and Rodriguez exchanged a startled glance. Neither had expected this turn. The Air Force is facing a shortage of highly skilled air traffic and aviation operations personnel, Hawthorne continued. Budget limits make it hard to recruit and train people with your level of experience. Meanwhile, we have a former top 5% pilot with an impeccable instinct for crisis management. Pushing a broom, she withdrew several documents from the folder and slid them across the desk toward Eleanor. I've reviewed your entire service record, including the classified evaluations from before your discharge. Your scores in flight skill, technical knowledge, and decision-making under pressure were consistently in the top 5% of all Air Force pilots. Eleanor glanced at the papers but didn't speak. 6 months ago, Hawthorne said, almost done, the Department of Defense started a new initiative, a program to recruit experienced aviation professionals into specialized civilian contractor roles. These positions capture talent that the military might otherwise lose to age limits or administrative discharges. She handed Eleanor a document stamped confidential. This is a position description for Senior Aviation Operations Specialist. The job includes emergency response coordination, advanced air traffic procedure management, and training development for high-risk scenarios. Everything you did tonight, only official and paid appropriately. Eleanor's eyes scanned the page, widening slightly as she absorbed the responsibilities and requirements. This is essentially a civilian version of military aviation operations management, she murmured. Exactly, Hawthorne said, with compensation that reflects your value, roughly 4 times your current custodial salary, full federal benefits. Security clearance restored. Rodriguez blinked. Ma'am, are you offering her a job? I'm offering her a chance to serve again, Hawthorne replied, in a role that recognizes her abilities, without the shackles of the regulations that once ended her career. Eleanor set the document down, her mind racing. Colonel, what about tonight? The unauthorized control, the security violations? Tonight will be classified as an emergency response handled by qualified personnel under extraordinary circumstances, Hawthorne said, her tone measured but firm. Rodriguez will be commended for recognizing when he needed help and acting to protect lives. You will be officially documented as having provided emergency consultation. Once you accept this position, your actions tonight will be retroactively legitimate. Hawthorne leaned forward, her voice softening just enough to convey sincerity. Miss Blackwood, the Air Force made a mistake 23 years ago. We chose rigid protocol over human judgment, and we lost an exceptional officer. Tonight gives us a chance to correct that mistake. Eleanor glanced at Rodriguez, whose grin was oitium and genuine, before turning back to the colonel. And what exactly would this position entail? You'd be stationed here at Peterson, Hawthorne said. You'd work with our air traffic operations, emergency response teams, and pilot training programs. You'd develop advanced procedures for complex emergencies, mentor both controllers and pilots, and serve as our subject matter expert when situations go beyond standard protocol. And if, for the first time in over 2 decades, Eleanor Blackwood felt something she thought she had lost forever, hope, real, stirring, overwhelming hope. Sitting across from Colonel Hawthorne in the quiet, fluorescent-lit office, she listened as he explained what the Air Force was offering her. If another emergency like tonight ever happens again, the colonel said, his voice firm but not unkind, you would be the person we call to coordinate the response. The words sank into her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. To think that, after years of sweeping hallways and emptying trash cans in the shadow of hangars, she might finally have the chance to return to aviation, real aviation, was almost too much to take in. A chance to put her skills back in the service of something larger than herself, to matter again. There's one condition, Hawthorne continued, leaning forward. This program requires a full background investigation and a psychological evaluation. Your previous service record will be reviewed in its entirety, including the Nevada incident. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? For a moment, Eleanor's mind slipped back to that desert sky, to the decision that had changed the course of her life. She remembered the heat, the smoke, the split-second choice to disobey regulations in order to save lives, and the years of consequences that had followed. Her voice was calm when she answered. Colonel, I've been living with the consequences of my decisions for more than 20 years, she said. I have nothing to hide. Hawthorne's sharp nod carried a weight of approval. Then we have an opportunity to turn tonight's crisis into tomorrow's solution. From the corner, young Marcus Rodriguez, still in his air traffic control headset, face pale with fatigue but glowing with adrenaline, spoke up. Ma'am, what about everyone else? The rescue teams, the emergency responders. They'll all be recognized, Hawthorne assured him. Tonight was a team effort that saved 8 lives and prevented the loss of millions in military assets. The colonel rose to his feet, signaling that the meeting was coming to a close. Miss Blackwood, I'll need your decision within 48 hours. Paperwork for the position will take weeks to process, but if you're interested, I want to start immediately. Eleanor stood slowly, feeling as if she were stepping across an invisible threshold, leaving her old life behind. Colonel, she said, her voice steady, I don't need 48 hours. If the Air Force is willing to give me a second chance to serve, my answer is yes. A rare smile flickered across Hawthorne's face. Outstanding. Report to personnel at 0800 tomorrow to begin the application process. Rodriguez, he added, excellent work tonight. Your judgment and professionalism under pressure reflect well on your training and character. As they exited the building into the pre-dawn darkness, the air was cool and heavy with the scent of wet tarmac. Eleanor felt something like completion, a piece of herself missing for decades, sliding back into place. The janitor who had walked the base halls in anonymity for 11 years was gone. In her place stood a woman about to reclaim her place in the sky. Rodriguez walked beside her, shaking his head in disbelief. When my shift started tonight, I never imagined it would end like this. Sometimes the most important moments of our lives, Eleanor said softly, come dressed as ordinary nights. The key is being ready when they arrive. Above them, the storm finally broke apart. A pale ribbon of dawn bled into the eastern horizon. On the tarmac, 8 F-18 Super Hornets gleamed under the clearing sky, safe and waiting for their pilots to return to their families. For the first time in 20 years, Captain Eleanor Mitchell, her name echoing in her heart like a vow, was going home to the sky. 6 months later, the morning sun poured through the tall windows of Peterson Air Force Base's brand new Aviation Operations Center. Eleanor Mitchell, now legally bearing her original name again, stood before a room filled with air traffic controllers, pilots, and emergency response personnel from across the Rocky Mountains. Today was the official launch of the Emergency Aviation Response Protocol, a comprehensive training program born from the lessons of that stormy March night. Eleanor faced the assembled crowd, her posture steady, her voice carrying the authority of experience. The core principle of advanced emergency coordination, she said, is that extraordinary situations demand extraordinary solutions. Standard procedures are the foundation, but they can't account for every storm, every engine failure, every convergence of bad luck that can happen in aviation. Major David Chun, one of the F-18 pilots from Crimson Squadron, raised his hand. Miss Mitchell, can you walk us through your landing sequence that night? The fuel calculations alone seemed impossible. Eleanor moved to the large display screen where a three-dimensional airspace diagram spun slowly. The key, she explained, was treating the emergency like a living puzzle. Every aircraft had different needs: fuel levels, mechanical problems, pilot capability, and those variables were constantly changing. Instead of following rigid procedures, we adapted in real time. She highlighted the radar tracks. Crimson 2 was critically low on fuel and needed immediate priority, but Crimson 6 had engine trouble that made standard approach procedures unsafe. For him, we developed a power-off gliding technique that balanced his mechanical limits and fuel conservation. Lieutenant Sarah Bradley, a new controller, frowned. But those procedures aren't in any manual. How did you know they'd work? Experience, Eleanor said simply, and theory. During my military career, I flew test flights for emergency procedures that most pilots never practice because they're too risky. That night, following the manual would have guaranteed a loss. Taking the risk was the safer choice. She played radar footage of that night, the paths of the aircraft converging like threads in a complex weave. Emergencies demand that we balance risk against certainty. A controlled gamble is sometimes the only way to save lives. At that moment, Colonel Hawthorne entered the room with a man in civilian attire. His badge read James Patterson, FAA Regional Administrator. Ladies and gentlemen, Hawthorne announced, we have special visitors. Patterson stepped forward, his voice resonant. I'm here to announce that the Emergency Aviation Response Protocol, developed here at Peterson Air Force Base, is being adopted as a national standard for both military and civilian aviation facilities. Your work has been validated through extensive testing, and it will now save lives across the country. Applause erupted. Eleanor felt a swell of pride, a deep satisfaction that the techniques that saved Crimson Squadron would now protect countless others. And, Patterson continued, I am pleased to announce that Miss Mitchell has been selected to lead the FAA's new Advanced Emergency Procedures Task Force. She will develop training standards and response protocols for the nation's most complex aviation emergencies. Rodriguez, now Staff Sergeant and Eleanor's deputy, grinned. Does this mean you're leaving Peterson? Not exactly, Eleanor said with a smile. The position is based here, but I'll be traveling to facilities nationwide. Peterson will serve as the headquarters for advanced emergency training. Major Chun raised his voice again. Miss Mitchell, do you ever miss flying? I mean, being in the cockpit? Eleanor paused, letting the question settle. 6 months ago, I would have said flying was the only part of my old life I truly missed. But coordinating that emergency taught me something. Flying is about the bond between pilot and machine. Aviation is about the entire system. The weather, the pilots, the technology, the decisions we make under pressure. That night, bringing Crimson Squadron home, I wasn't just flying. I was using everything I'd ever learned about the sky, and in its own way, that was even more powerful than piloting. Administrator Patterson nodded, visibly impressed. That mindset is exactly why this program works. Emergencies aren't just procedures, they're living systems. And this approach treats them that way. Eleanor gazed out the window at the flight line where F-18s glinted in the sunlight. For the first time in over 20 years, she didn't just feel like a pilot. She felt like the heart of aviation itself. Colonel Hawthorne stood before the group, her posture crisp, the weight of authority in her voice unmistakable. I want to share some information that illustrates just how far we've come, she began, sweeping her gaze across the small, comfy conference room filled with flight, personnel, and aviation experts. Since implementing these new procedures, Peterson Air Force Base has successfully handled 12 separate emergency situations. In each case, not only were standard protocols met, but they were exceeded. A quiet murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the room as she tapped a control, and a display flickered to life with charts and data points. Other facilities that adopted the same approach have reported similar improvements, she continued. What's even more significant is that we've managed to identify and prevent several potential disasters by spotting early warning signs that our old procedures would have overlooked. By emphasizing continuous assessment and adaptive response, we've fundamentally changed how we approach aviation safety. From the back, Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, still new to the night shift and still slightly in awe of the veterans around him, raised his hand hesitantly. Ma'am, he asked, what would you say is the biggest difference in how controllers handle their duties now? Confidence, Hawthorne replied without hesitation. Air traffic controllers now know they have options when confronted with extraordinary circumstances. They're trained not just to follow the checklist, but to recognize when a situation exceeds standard protocol and to adapt their responses intelligently. She gestured to the screen again, which now displayed a series of complex emergency response flowcharts. The old model assumed that if you followed the book, everything would work out. The new model acknowledges that sometimes life throws you something the book never covered. That's when innovative thinking, grounded in safety principles, becomes essential. Major Sarah Chun, sitting with arms crossed, leaned back and thought. It's like the difference between flying strictly by checklist and flying with a real understanding of your aircraft's systems, she said slowly. The checklist keeps you safe in normal conditions, but systems knowledge gives you options when the checklist doesn't have an answer. Exactly, Eleanor Blackwood, once Captain Eleanor Mitchell, added quietly, the memory of that stormy night still etched in her mind. Emergency response is problem-solving under pressure. Procedures are a foundation, but human judgment is what saves lives when the unexpected happens. Administrator Patterson, who had been flipping through his notes, looked up. His tone shifted, more formal now. I want to touch on an issue that stirred some debate since the Crimson Squadron incident. There's been ongoing discussion about whether civilian personnel should be allowed to take control of military air traffic operations in an emergency. The room grew still. Everyone knew the controversy surrounding Eleanor's actions that night, how she, a janitor in name but a decorated former Air Force pilot in truth, had stepped in when the tower was overwhelmed. Patterson continued, after extensive legal review, the FAA and the Department of Defense have issued new guidelines for emergency authority. Qualified personnel, regardless of their current employment status, may now be authorized to assist when their expertise exceeds that of the certified controllers on duty. Colonel Hawthorne nodded. In other words, we no longer waste critical talent because of bureaucratic walls. Of course, authorization and verification procedures must still be followed, but in an emergency, the best qualified person will lead the response. From the far side of the table, Lieutenant Bradley raised a question. How do we determine who qualifies as exceptional in the heat of the moment? Through training and certification, Eleanor answered. We've developed an advanced certification program that goes beyond standard ATC qualifications. People with extensive aviation experience, including former military and airline pilots, can now earn emergency response credentials that officially authorize them to step in when things go sideways. She nodded toward a schedule posted on the wall. We've already begun training seasoned aviation professionals, mechanics, operations specialists, even retired captains, so that when a crisis hits, we can utilize every ounce of expertise available. Rodriguez's eyes widened. So it's not just about who happens to be on duty anymore. The system is designed to pull in all the knowledge we've got. Exactly, Eleanor said with a faint smile. Aviation safety is far too important to be trapped by the job titles. Patterson checked his watch, then looked back to the group. One last point before we wrap up. This program is no longer limited to the military. The techniques pioneered here at Peterson are now being integrated into civilian air traffic control nationwide. Commercial airports, regional hubs, and even international agencies are requesting training. He handed Eleanor a thick folder. This is your formal authorization to establish the International Emergency Aviation Response Institute. Peterson will serve as the hub for training aviation professionals from around the globe. Eleanor turned the document over in her hands, feeling the gravity of what it meant. The janitor who had spent more than a decade in the shadows was now tasked with shaping how the world responded to airborne emergencies. This means, she said softly, we'll be training personnel from civilian airports, military facilities, and international aviation organizations? Correct, Patterson confirmed. The same procedures that saved 8 F-18s on a stormy night in Colorado are now being recognized as essential knowledge worldwide. As the meeting ended and the room emptied, Major Chun lingered. She approached Eleanor quietly, her voice low and sincere. Miss Mitchell, I never really thanked you for that night. I was Crimson 5, the one with the electrical failure. Your voice, your guidance during that manual approach, it saved my life. Eleanor shook her head, offering a firm handshake. You saved your own life, Major. You trusted your training and flew the jet. I just gave you the information you needed. Chun's expression softened. It was more than that. You gave me confidence when everything felt impossible. That's a kind of leadership they can't teach in a classroom. When Chun departed, Rodriguez drifted over to the window where the late afternoon sun spilled across the flight line. F-18s rolled and climbed in disciplined arcs, practicing approaches. Do you ever think about what might have happened, he asked quietly, if you hadn't been in the tower that night? Eleanor's eyes stayed on the sky. I think about it often. 8 highly trained pilots in 8 high-performance aircraft trapped in weather that no checklist could solve. Statistically, we probably would have lost at least 2 jets, maybe more. She paused, then spoke with a distant, reflective tone. But what I think about even more is this. How many people out there are working in jobs that don't use their full abilities? How much brilliance do we waste because it doesn't fit a neat category? The custodian who's a born engineer, the mechanic who understands aircraft better than the people who design them, the administrator who could revolutionize operations if anyone gave them the chance. Rodriguez nodded slowly. So that night proved that extraordinary talent can come from the most unexpected places. Exactly. Our job is to build systems that can recognize and use that talent, especially when the stakes are life and death. He chuckled softly. From janitor to international aviation expert in 6 months. That's one hell of a career change. Eleanor laughed, the sound light but edged with truth. I like to think of it as finally being seen for what I always was. The knowledge, the experience, they were always there. The storm just made everyone else notice. As the sun sank lower, casting long golden lines across the operations center, Eleanor reflected on the long road that had brought her here. 23 years earlier, she had faced an impossible choice. Follow the rules or save lives. Now, because of that choice, Controllers and pilots across the globe would sleep knowing that adaptive thinking and human judgment had become official pillars of aviation safety. The janitor who once listened from the shadows had become the architect of a new era in emergency response. Sometimes the most critical contributions come from the least likely sources, and sometimes the greatest victories are born from what first felt like defeat. Above Peterson Air Force Base, the aircraft continued their endless ballet between earth and sky, guided now by procedures forged from a single extraordinary night, when the rules were not enough, and human courage filled the gap. 3 years later, Eleanor Mitchell would stand in the Grand Assembly Hall of the United Nations Aviation Council in Geneva, addressing officials, pilots, and emergency coordinators from 57 nations. The protocols born of that desperate night, when 8 F-18s fought their way through a Colorado thunderstorm, had now become the International Emergency Aviation Response Standards. Excellence in aviation safety, she said, her voice carrying across the chamber, is not achieved through blind adherence to procedures. It is achieved through the intelligent, courageous application of expertise. Eleanor Blackwood, once Captain Eleanor Mitchell of the U.S. Air Force, now a global authority in aviation emergencies, stood at the podium facing an audience of the world's leading aviation experts. The International Civil Aviation Organization's 3-day conference in Geneva had drawn to a close, and she had been invited to deliver the final address. Miss Mitchell's work, Dr. Maria Santos, the ICAO Secretary General, had said in her introduction, has fundamentally transformed the way we approach aviation emergencies worldwide. The protocols she helped develop at Peterson Air Force Base are now standard across every continent. Among the rows of dignitaries sat Marcus Rodriguez, once the nervous young air traffic controller on a lonely night at night shift, now a master sergeant and director of emergency operations at Peterson. Beside him was Major Sarah Chone, Eleanor's old wingman during the 2001 F-16 incident, now one of the Air Force's top instructors in advanced emergency procedures. Both watched with quiet pride as the woman they had once worked alongside, often overlooked and underestimated, addressed the world's leaders. The night that changed it everything, Eleanor began, started with a simple truth. Sometimes standard procedures aren't enough. When that happens, human expertise must step into the gap between regulation and reality. The real challenge is ensuring that expertise is recognized and used, no matter where in an organization it happens to exist. She gestured toward a massive digital display showing global aviation statistics. Since implementing adaptive emergency response protocols, participating nations have reported a 47% reduction in aircraft losses during complex emergencies, she said. Even more importantly, we've prevented an estimated 312 potential disasters by identifying dangerous conditions before they escalated into crises. Dr. Santos nodded, her expression one of deep satisfaction. These aren't just numbers, she said quietly. They represent lives saved, families spared the grief of aviation tragedies. After the applause, Eleanor joined a smaller group for the signing of the International Aviation Emergency Response Accord. Delegates from the United States, the European Union, China, Japan, Russia, and Brazil all signed, formally committing to adopt the new protocols in their national aviation systems. Watching the signatures flow across the historic document, Eleanor couldn't help but think of the path that had brought her here. Just 3 years ago, she had been invisible, a janitor at Peterson Air Force Base. Her expertise had been unrecognized, her voice unheard. Now, procedures that bore her name were studied by aviation professionals around the world. Later that evening, Dos Santos pulled her aside. Miss Mitchell, she said, I have a proposition for you. The ICAO is creating a global aviation emergency response center. We need someone to serve as the founding director. Someone with practical experience and the vision to coordinate international emergency response operations. Eleanor blinked, weighing the enormity of the offer. What exactly would that entail? Coordinating response resources across borders, developing international crisis protocols, establishing rapid response teams that can deploy anywhere in the world within hours. In short, building a global network of aviation emergency expertise. Eleanor exhaled slowly. That's a tremendous responsibility. It is, Santos agreed, but think of the alternative. Emergencies that could be resolved with international support but aren't, because the mechanisms to share expertise don't exist. A crisis in Southeast Asia could be solved with help from specialists in North America. This center will make that possible. That night, from her hotel room in Geneva, Eleanor video called Marcus Rodriguez and Colonel Hawthorne at Peterson. Afternoon sunlight lit the F-18s training on the flight line behind them. "The offer is incredible," Rodriguez said after hearing her out. "But if you take it, you'd have to leave Peterson for good." "Not necessarily," Eleanor said with a faint smile. "The center could be based anywhere. Peterson already has the world's most advanced emergency response training facilities. There's no reason the Global Center couldn't be in Colorado." Colonel Hawthorne leaned forward, his own smile forming. "In fact, there are several reasons why it should be. Peterson's central location, our existing international training programs, and our infrastructure make it the perfect headquarters for global operations." Rodriguez's eyes widened. "So instead of losing you to an international organization, Peterson would become the hub for global aviation emergency coordination?" "Exactly," Eleanor said. "We wouldn't be leaving anything behind. We'd be expanding it." 2 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the control tower where she had once emptied trash bins and mopped floors. It was unrecognizable. Banks of screens now displayed real-time aviation operations across the globe. Live communication links connected the center to air traffic facilities, military bases, and civilian airports on every continent. Marcus Rodriguez, now Deputy Director of the Global Aviation Emergency Response Center, scanned incoming reports. "Consultation request from Tokyo International," he said. "They're facing a complex weather emergency, multiple aircraft diverting." "What's the situation?" Eleanor asked, settling into the director's chair that once would have seemed impossible for her to claim. "Severe thunderstorms have shut down their primary runways. 18 wide-body aircraft are inbound with low fuel, no options to divert. Winds are marginal on the secondary runway. Tokyo is requesting guidance on emergency sequencing." Eleanor leaned over the data feeds and weather maps. The scene was eerily familiar. The same type of desperate, storm-choked night that had once changed her life. But this time, her reach extended far beyond a single base. "Connect me to Tokyo Tower," she said calmly. "We'll walk them through adaptive sequencing based on each aircraft's fuel status and passenger load." As the international call came online, she guided Tokyo controllers step by step through the emergency. The protocols born from that stormy Colorado night, the night Crimson Squadron had nearly been lost, now rippled across the globe, protecting hundreds of civilian lives. Master Sergeant Sarah Chun, now Chief of Training Operations at the Global Center, hurried in with an update. "Ma'am, Tokyo reports all 18 aircraft are sequenced and landing safely. The emergency is under control." Eleanor allowed herself a brief smile. "Excellent. Log the entire case in the training database." Situations like this are exactly why this center exists. When the Tokyo crisis ended, Eleanor walked to the window overlooking Peterson's flight line. The view hadn't changed, but she had. No longer an outsider, she now coordinated life-saving operations across the planet. Her desk phone rang again. Another emergency, this one from a military installation in Australia struggling with helicopter rescues in extreme weather. She picked it up without hesitation, ready to guide them. As she spoke, Eleanor reflected on her journey. Once she had pushed a janitor's cart through these halls, her expertise hidden in plain sight. That single night when she had stepped out of the shadows to save Crimson Squadron had changed everything. It proved that excellence can come from the most unexpected places, and that when procedures fail, human ingenuity must take the lead. Now the protocols forged in that storm had become the foundation for a new era of aviation safety, one built on adaptability, expertise, and international cooperation. As Peterson Air Force Base eased into evening operations, Eleanor Blackwood prepared for another night of global vigilance. Somewhere an aircraft would face the unimaginable. And when that moment came, the voice that had once been ignored in the shadows would be the one the world turned to. Sometimes the most remarkable journeys begin the moment someone chooses to step forward, recognized or not, because they know lives depend on it.